Okay, so now we are in the fifth part of Frederick the Great's Life of War.
Incredibly ambitious. For an army facing enemies on the northern, eastern, and southern front, it perhaps was a bit too ambitious. The siege of Olmütz became one of the critical events of Prussia's 1758 campaign, especially because of a battle some 20 miles north of the besieged fortress. The Battle of Domstadtel would radically change Frederick's plans for the year. It is the early morning of August 25th, 1758, an exceptionally hot day. As the Prussian columns marched along the river bank, intending to flank the Russians, a hussar scout hastily approached Frederick the Great. He told the king the Russians did not realize they were being flanked in time and left their entire baggage train behind their front lines.
Oh,
It stood
wow.
there, ready to be mopped up. It would be a decisive blow and would not even warrant a battle. Frederick, angered at the destruction the Russians inflicted on the countryside, did not act on this information. Instead, he spurred his army onwards. The Battle of Zorndorf, described as one of the bloodiest battles of the 18th century, was about to commence.
Hmm. Assuming Frederick wins, it'll be a great victory, but obviously not without cost. He had an opportunity, I guess the way he said it, if he just cedes the baggage train to, have a bloodless victory, which is, I think, always good, but again, like, I guess also the potential of just getting rid of a Russian army like this is also good. And if he wins, he can't have the baggage train after if all goes well, so I guess, but still, I don't know. I guess we'll find out.
After the disastrous ambush at Domstadtel, Frederick abandoned the siege of Olmütz. He returned to the fortress of Glatz. Austrian Field Marshal Daun, notorious for his patient and cautious campaigning, did pursue the Prussians. However, he did so at a pace you would expect. The retreat from Moravia was orderly and even allowed Frederick to launch small counterattacks against the Austrian vanguard. The British envoy described it as the retreat of a lion, keeping his enemies at bay. The disaster and the implications of the campaign should not be underestimated. Nobody at that time knew the ambush of Domstadtel marked the end of Frederick's final attempt to invade the Habsburg monarchy. The
Oh
year
wow,
was
really?
far from over. To Prussia's northeast, an army arguably just as dangerous as the Austrians and certainly more brutal advanced. By August, the Russians, commanded by General Firmer, advanced from the east towards Küstrin, a strategically vital stronghold protecting Frederick's capital, Berlin. Some 26,000 Prussians held Küstrin. They were heavily outnumbered. Frederick understood the seriousness of the situation, so he gathered his army, some 11,000 soldiers, and embarked on a speed march against Firmer. He planned to beat the Russians, turn to Silesia, and face Daun. Frederick began his march on August 11. 4 days later, Firmer reached Küstrin and began its bombardment, while his Cossack detachments plundered neighboring settlements. After 1 week of heavy shelling, Frederick's army arrived in the region. The Prussians marched over 250 kilometers in 12 days. Like before at the
Wow.
Battle of Leuthen, the Prussian military proved tenacious. Their arrival prompted Firmer to abandon the bombardment and take positions to the north.
Man, Frederick keeps glazing the Russians. He's like, they're the greatest. And obviously they are. I mean, they are a dangerous force. Like I said, I'm not entirely aware of the complete strength of each army in this time. Obviously, the French aren't performing that well. At least on mainland Europe. The Austrians, they're kind of doing alright in this series. The Prussians are doing pretty good too. And yeah, I guess we haven't seen much of the Russians so far. We've only seen such a little bit. But obviously Frederick fears them. And, you know, even wanted to avoid war with them at all costs. And again, as we know, the Russians, if they have one advantage I know for a fact that they always have, is just their manpower. Like, they can really overwhelm you, especially with Prussia, I think. I think when it, as we've seen, manpower can overrun Prussia, and I think if anyone has that in spades, it's definitely Russia. As I think they may have the most numerical superiority, usually in a lot of history videos we've seen. So I think just for that fact alone, you know, they're really formidable, and I could see why Frederick is afraid.
Frederick approached through the devastated Küstrin and neighboring villages, inciting a fierce hatred and yearning for revenge among the Prussian soldiers. The writings of a Prussian soldier survive. We were all smoldering with anger over the destruction of Küstrin and the sufferings of the poor country people. The enemy had wasted and destroyed everything, and even broken into churches and robbed them. Many of the people had been horribly injured or even killed by the Cossacks' whips. As Firmer moved away from Küstrin, Frederick followed him on the other bank of the river. The maneuvering directly preceding the Battle of Zorndorf lasted nearly 2 days. The Prussians camped nearby a tributary of the Oder, the Mitzel. On the other side of the river camped Firmer with his army. Both sides commanded considerable numbers of soldiers, but when Firmer learned of Frederick's approach, he mistakenly assumed part of the Prussians would approach his south. So he sent a detachment of around 11,000 soldiers down south to protect a river crossing. It left Firmer with around 43 to 45,000 soldiers, 36,500 infantry, 3,500 cavalry, 3,000 Cossacks, and 136 artillery pieces. These were deployed in roughly 2 lines stretching to Quartschen, between 2 protective hollows, the Zaberngrund and the Langengrund, facing north. Frederick commanded around 36,000 soldiers, about 10,500 cavalry and 25,500 infantry, and 193 artillery pieces. The terrain around Zorndorf was characterized by marshes and bogs. Small contingents of Prussian engineers installed pontoon bridges to the camp's east. From the camp, Frederick could see some Russians. The thick vegetation made it difficult to assess their exact positions, however. That night, the Prussian army camped nearby Darmitzel, a village nearby the installed pontoon bridges. Frederick used local forestry experts to guide his army through the boggy terrain. He decided on a long approach, protected by cavalry on the flanks. At 3 a.m., the infantry began its march through the forest along the Russian flank. The cavalry traveled further away from the front lines. Along their march, they passed burning and looted villages. The Russians were quick to realize their enemy was on the move. Firmer initially deployed his force facing north towards the Prussian camp. He now rotated his army to face the other way. Marshy terrain now enveloped his rear. No retreat would be possible. The Prussians...
Yeah, I was gonna say, the positioning, I suppose if there were a more, you know, if any other direction would be ideal for a more defensive position, like if it had been from north or south or whatnot. But the fact that Frederick is now using the flank and going right here in more open area, essentially they're kind of trapped, the Russians. They're forced to now give a fight, you know, and again, no retreat. Their back is to a river, which I think is never a good position to fight in. We've seen a lot of battles where when an enemy has their back to a river and they lose, usually that can result in a big retreat and kind of like retreat issues. I think there's a bridge right here, but even then, you know, like things can happen. I don't think it's ever ideal. Granted, we've seen some battles where those odds have been overcome, but most of the time, probably fighting with a body of water behind you is never ideal, I think, especially if it's deep. But again, once again, Frederick has been using his positioning really well, I think. Like, he really is great at maneuvering, and I notice he's getting better at it as the series goes on.
Russian vanguard had long passed Butzlow, and many were already approaching their final positions when scouts notified Frederick of a lucky break. Not just any lucky break, but one that could potentially win them the battle. Drawn up nearby Groß-Gamin stood the entire Russian baggage train. Because Firmer mistakenly presumed the battle would take place to his north, the baggage train stood in their front instead far in their rear. Destroying the carriages would force the Russians to leave the region, for they would be undersupplied. But Frederick refused to act on this information, holding strong contempt for the Russians and seeking military victory. By 9 a.m., the Prussian army reached their final positions, and immediately Colonel von Moller's artillery opened fire.
Again, with the baggage train thing, in my head it sounds better to secure a victory without bloodshed, and already that would create a logistical issue, and again, I probably might have gone for that, but again, at the same time, defeating the Russians decisively, you have more to gain from that, because that would help hamper them even worse, but again, that's easier said than done, because this... This is probably going to be an incredibly bloody affair, so you're not walking out without damage yourself. That's the thing, though.
An artillery duel lasting 2 hours followed. It appeared neither side broke. By 11 a.m., the Prussians launched a staggered attack from their left. Here they concentrated most of their power throughout the battle. Artillery in front of Zorndorf continued launching volleys as General Manteuffel charged ahead against the Russian right flank. The remainder of the infantry under Lieutenant General Kanitz advanced to his right rear. Far behind followed Bieberstein's cavalry, and across the river, Seydlitz's cavalry followed parallel to Manteuffel's army. As this flank advanced, the Prussian right remained stationary, preventing any other Russian contingents from coming to their right flank's aid. Soon, things went wrong. The Prussian artillery hit multiple Russian powder weapons. The explosions were deafening and smoke filled the air. This cluttered the infantry's vision, leaving them to be sitting ducks. The Russian infantry launched volleys from point-blank range against the haphazardly advancing Prussians. Kanitz's infantry fell behind and pulled too far to the right, as their commander was afraid he would suffer a charge from the Russian center. But this exposed Manteuffel's right flank. The Russian cavalry did not hesitate a moment and launched a charge. The charge
Dang, oh my goodness, that positioning was bad.
against the vanguard was merciless and relatively unopposed. As a result, some units reportedly lost 2/3 of their men before retreating in an uncoordinated rout. In utter panic, Frederick ordered Seydlitz to attack and relieve the infantry. Seydlitz allegedly replied, "Tell the king that after the battle, my head is at his disposal, but until then I will do as I see fit." Thanks to Manteuffel's retreat, Kanitz's left flank was exposed.
Dang.
The front on the left was too broad. Upon their fleeing, Russian artillery bombarded the infantry with volleys. In an iconic moment, Frederick decided to pick up a standard to stop the panicked troops from retreating, a scene immortalized by Karl Rückling's painting. Some units remained, augmented by Bieberstein's cavalry plugging the left flank. Things did not look good for the Prussians. To the right, General Donna's army moved forward to protect Kanitz's exposed right flank. But before they advanced further, General Thomas von der Miku launched a counterattack against Donna's infantry and Schirlemer's cavalry. Saltykov's infantry joined soon after. This was the moment Seydlitz was waiting for. The center would not reinforce the Russian right. He ordered his 36 squadrons of cuirassiers and hussars to launch a charge across the steep slopes of the Zaberngrund.
Oh, dang, and get right behind them. Wow.
A mix of Russian cavalry and infantry mowing away against Kanitz did not expect the cavalry to complete this maneuver in such a quick and agile manner. Surprised and confused, they suffered the brunt of Seydlitz's charge.
Dang, Seydlitz. Okay, like, that was smart. I mean, that was ballsy to straight up tell Frederick no like that. But, that's pretty impressive, I have to say. Okay, good initiative on his part.
A brief skirmish erupted, but the Prussian cavalry bested the Russians. Their entire right flank collapsed and fled in disorder. Some fled to the woods behind Quarchen, others to the center, many to their camps, which they plundered for brandy. The Russian right and Prussian left flank spent the remainder of the battle mopping up scattered Russian units. Frederick levied 2 of Seydlitz's squadrons to reinforce the center. The combat was exceptionally savage. Brutal battle, drunkenness, and carnage littered the battlefield. Both sides ran out of gunpowder, and savage hand-to-hand combat ensued. Both sides used their bayonets to try and beat their enemies, as the battle lines became more disorganized over time. It continued for hours. By 8:30 p.m., the fighting nearly disintegrated both armies. The central command undoubtedly broke down. Frederick tried to summon enough troops to launch one final charge against the Russians nearby the Galgengrund, but to no avail. Dona's men now held the original Russian position, whereas the Russians were pushed towards Zorndorf. By 9 p.m., darkness fell, and the fighting ceased, apart from a few scattered skirmishes. The battle had been more confusing, cluttered, and prolonged than usual. Frederick moved his army to Wilkersdorf, while Firmer created a defensive perimeter at Zorndorf. Tim Blenning wrote,
Wow. Yeah, the positioning is just dramatically changing so much already and still going. I thought that would have definitely been the end, but nah, they're going even more apparently.
The Russians suffered 42% and the Prussians 35% casualties, an enormous number. The Prussians lost nearly 13,000 men, around 3,700 dead, 7,200 wounded, and 1,900 prisoners. The Russians lost over 20,000 men, 6,600 killed, over nearly 12,000 wounded, and 2,500 prisoners were missing. Because of the enormous number of casualties, neither side could follow up the situation. That night, the Russian army withdrew, shrouded in darkness. Frederick was in no position to pursue them. Contemporaries describe the Battle of Zorndorf as one of the bloodiest of the 18th century. The brutality of the battle stuck out, and the fact the Russians did not retreat despite suffering so many casualties and a significant number of friendly fire incidents struck with the Prussians. Both sides claimed victory, and both Berlin and St. Petersburg celebrated as such. Frederick sent letters to friends and family claiming he inflicted 30,000 casualties against a Russian force numbering over 80,000. Frederick's confidence and feeling of superiority proved to be misplaced. A Saxon artillery captain, Johann Gottlieb Tilke, who served the Russians, remarked, "The extraordinary steadiness and intrepidity of the Russians on this occasion is not to be described. It surpassed everything that one has heard of the bravest troops. Although the Prussians' balls mowed down whole ranks, yet not a man discovered any symptoms of unsteadiness or inclination to give way, and the openings in the first line were instantly filled up from the second or the reserve." Military historians prolifically criticized Frederick for the needless slaughter among his men and the Russians. The consensus is that the battle would have been over before it even started if he had captured the Russian baggage train. It would force the Russians to retreat to more fertile regions. Historians also agree that Zorndorf marked Frederick. The indescribable carnage of the battle and the preceding pillaging left the king both angered and impressed with his adversary. Because of the absolute terror inflicted on the surrounding countryside, there was nothing for the Russians to extract. They decided to retreat to the east. Their retreat was stimulated by a conflict between the Austrians and Russians. Firmer, rightly, was angered at the lack of support from his Austrian allies. The fact the Austrian envoy openly doubted his command abilities did certainly not help. Firmer retreated to the Baltic coast, laid siege to some insignificant fortresses, and did not attempt to invade anymore. In that sense, the battle was a victory for the Prussians. The Austrian lack of action was because they were busy in the west. Daun prepared an attack against Saxony. The Battle of Hochkirch would not happen for another month, but the battle pitted 36,000 Prussians against 80,000 Austrians, an incredible discrepancy, and the battle would enter history books as one of Frederick the Great's greatest blunders. It is the early morning, October 15, 1758. Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, is asleep in his headquarters at Rodewitz. Nearby, sounds of gunfire, cannons and screams pollute the quiet morning. His generals storm in, attempting to get him out of bed. A major Austrian offensive has begun, and the Prussian army, deployed in a long, thin line, is at risk of being overrun. Frederick responds in a disgruntled manner. Surely these are just some skirmishes. Panicked, the generals leave the room to organize defense themselves. The Battle of Hochkirch had just begun. Is that
Okay, so apparently the Austrians are about to just get the drop on Prussia and Frederick ain't taking it seriously. Oh my goodness.
and underestimation of the enemy would become one of Frederick's most costly mistakes.
Oh boy.
Prussia's 1758 campaign of the 7 Years' War had not exactly been going great. The only one making real progress was his brother-in-law Ferdinand of Brunswick against the French in the west. On the eastern front, Frederick abandoned the siege of Olmütz after the disastrous ambush at the Battle of Domstadten. The subsequent Battle of Zorndorf against the Russians had been exceptionally bloody and savage. As the Prussians were burying the dead in mass graves, Frederick received alarming news from his brother. A few weeks earlier, when retreating from the siege of Olmütz to intercept the Russians, Frederick stationed his brother Prince Henry in Saxony to prevent an Austrian advance. Vermeer's anger at the lack of Austrian support during Zorndorf was the writing on the wall. There weren't Austrians to augment his army because they were concentrated against Saxony. In late August, General Loudon's light troops marched into Lower Lusatia. Field Marshal Daun and the main Austrian army followed via Gorlitz. They marched against Prince Henry's positions, south of Dresden. The prince commanded 20,000 soldiers at best, nowhere near enough to hold out against Daun's 80,000 combined Austrian imperial force.
Ooh.
Frederick immediately collected 15,000 soldiers to march west. Luck struck when Vermeer's army retreated towards the Baltic coast, freeing more soldiers. General Dohna remained nearby Küstrin in case Vermeer returned. Frederick embarked on another long and grueling march to his brother's aid. Daun learned of Frederick's approach during this march, and he positioned his army at Stolpen, to Dresden's east. Despite the overwhelming numbers and lack of Prussian reinforcements, Daun failed to capitalize on his advantage. Despite scorching weather and Zorndorf's aftermath, Frederick's army managed to cover 110 miles, around 180 kilometers, in 7 days. An impressive
Dang. Dude, these forced marches that Frederick is doing is kind of amazing. He's making so much ground and covering so fast. Like the calves of the freaking Prussian soldiers must be amazing. But it's going to show you just how fast he is. He's just zooming to multiple fronts.
Distance, causing many casualties among the battered Prussians. Daun occupied the hills around Dresden. Elsewhere, the situation heated up as well. The Swedes finally kicked into action. In late September, General Karl Heinrich von Wedel scored a victory against the Swedes at Tornhof and Fehrbellin. For now, the Swedes were kept in check. Frederick's arrival unnerved Daun. He wanted to fight the Prussians in optimal conditions. By early October, Daun marched towards Silesia.
The dude really just said these conditions are not optimal. Daun has defeated Frederick before, though. So, like, this has kind of been the rematch that I've been waiting for. I want to see, like, round 2 of Daun versus Frederick. Daun feels like the final boss. Like, he's giving final boss energy right now. Like, Frederick needs to avenge himself on him.
Frederick shadowed him. He hoped that if he pushed Dawn, the field marshal would fall back towards Zittau. Instead, a game of cat and mouse developed. For days, Dawn pulled back his army as Frederick grew frustrated, trying to force a battle. Dawn received pressure from Vienna. They criticized his timid, he called it cautious, maneuvering and lack of action. They warned him the French and Russians would withdraw from the alliance if he did not fight. On October 7, Dawn set up camp at Kittlitz. Frederick followed suit. He was confident Dawn wouldn't attack, not in the least thanks to a spy in the Austrian camp feeding him information. But little did Frederick know this spy was compromised, feeding him.
Dang. Dawn, about to get another one up. Well, not like in terms of a victory, we don't know if he's gonna win, but then again, the opening kind of show that the Prussians are about to be put in a bad position. Point is, at least right now, catching Frederick with his pants down once again through this wit. Again, like, Dawn's smart himself. Like, Frederick's not an idiot. He's not. Frederick has used his wit to trick his enemies, but Dawn's also using that to trick Frederick, which is impressive on its own. Like I said, I think Dawn's so far kind of like been a rival. A pretty steadfast and strong rival to Frederick, frustrating his plans, defeating him that one time, studying Frederick. Like I'm saying, he's giving final boss energy. Like, man.
Exactly what Dawn wanted him to know.
That's leaving a lot to chance there, Frederick.
On October 10, Frederick arrived in Hochgier. He spotted Dawn's entire army from an elevated position. Dawn commanded around 80,000 soldiers, whereas Frederick commanded no more than 36,000. To the north at Reichenbach, Prince Christoph of Baden-Durlach commanded some 16,000 soldiers, facing General Wolf on Retzow's force. Stationed at Weissenberg, he was about 4 miles detached from the main Prussian army. Despite being heavily outnumbered and the terrain not playing in his favor, Frederick decided to wait for supply reinforcements. Dawn's reputation as a cautious and slow commander led him to believe he would not dare to attack. He set up his headquarters at Rodewitz. The fact Dawn deployed to the village's east, including on strategically essential elevations, unnerved most of his generals, except for Frederick himself. Keith repeatedly warned the king, who chose to ignore these warnings. They were surrounded by slight elevations. The most prominent was the Kupritzerberg, facing the Prussian right flank. The Prussian line was stretched thin, spanning 4 miles in an S shape. Keith commanded the soldiers near Hochgier, 4 battalions, an artillery battery, and Zieten's cavalry. To the southwest, some light irregulars roamed the forest. General Lacy convinced Dawn to exploit his weakness, although Dawn spent 3 days reconnoitering before deciding to mount a full attack. It was clear Dawn had the strategic high ground, and the Prussians were in the dark entirely. Frederick ordered only the usual pickets, allowed to sleep inside, and the cavalry to unsaddle their horses. Keith and Zieten refused these orders. On the night of
Yeah, Frederick is kind of being a bit too overconfident. Granted, he's acting on false information and etc. But, like, let's hope that they're just afraid of us. 1. 2, acting on false information. 3, very unvigilant of Frederick. No wonder he gets put in a bad position. And even when he's being attacked, he's still like, it's just a skirmish. Like, Frederick is being very uncharacteristically unvigilant. So yeah, this isn't good. And Dawn, while he's being criticized for being slow and very cautious, I think methodical is the word that I'm catching. He's very methodical, I feel, more so. At least that's the impression that I'm getting. Probably more cerebral in his decisions. You know, and again, he's deprived Frederick of battles he wanted. Like, Frederick wanted to fight him, like, twice already, and, like, Dawn is denying him that, frustrating him, and, you know, he's... Dawn is taking the initiative away from Frederick, I feel, and he's operating on his own terms, not Frederick's. And I think that is dangerous when you seize the initiative. So yeah.
Of October 13, the Austrians kept their campfires burning. By morning, the workmen began felling trees, business as usual, in the Austrian camp. Except the main army departed. The long morning march through difficult terrain went surprisingly smooth. By 3:30 a.m., most of the Austrian army reached their intended positions to attack. Dawn personally led the main assault through the woods, commanding 30,000 soldiers. Loudon advanced from the southwest with a mixed infantry-cavalry contingent. General O'Donnell circumvented the woods and elevations entirely and approached from the west. The Duke of Arenberg commanded 20,000 infantry approaching from the northeast. By 4 a.m. the Austrians were in position. Loudon was the first to engage in combat, with the Prussian irregulars roaming the woods. Fighting broke out as the Prussian artillery opened fire blindly upon hearing the noise of battle. An artillery duel emerged. This continued until Loudon's grenadiers crept up behind the southernmost artillery battery and quickly neutralized all soldiers.
Dang. Just look at these maneuvers, like, completely catching the Prussians with their pants down, man.
On the Prussian right flank, officers realized their pickets in the woods had been overrun and an attack was imminent. Panic erupted as soldiers scrambled to take their positions and man the artillery. The Austrian infantry was already entering Hochkirch from the south. Then Loudon's cavalry charged into the Prussian lines from the west. Many soldiers were mercilessly slain without even having the chance to put up a fight. A regiment from the center line was the first to respond. They swerved south before attacking Loudon's force. Half-dressed grenadiers decided to form a spirited defense, but they were heavily outnumbered. The entire right flank was overrun, with many soldiers retreating to the north. Prussian officers had trouble getting Frederick out of bed. The king attributed the noise of battle to the usual morning skirmishes with Croatian irregulars. Most of the haphazardly formed defense was coordinated by Zieten, Keith, and Seydlitz.
Dang, all these guys are gonna have to carry because Frederick is literally just sleeping. Oh my goodness.
While Austrian howitzers opened fire and burned large parts of the village. Finally, Frederick learned the ugly truth of the situation developing when some rounds hit his headquarters. He ordered his army to evacuate, dispatched a courier to goad the 16,000-strong army stationed around 4 miles to the north into action, and sent 3 regiments under Prince Francis of Brunswick towards Hochkirch. Zieten mounted a counterattack against Dawn's main army. Though holding them back initially, his hussars would not be able to hold out against the overwhelming force. Within Hochkirch, Keith attempted to lead an assault to recapture the heavy artillery. Instead, he was shot through the chest before a cannonball knocked him off his horse, killing him instantly.
Not Keith. Oh man, that sucks.
To the northeast,
I loved him because his name was easy to say. I'm sorry, Keith is like such a California name here. I'm from California, this is where I operate. It's just like Keith sounds like a total like surfer dude name. So I loved him because he's probably the only person outside from Frederick whose name I can accurately pronounce. Poor Keith.
Arenberg launched an attack against the Prussian battalions and battery of 30 cannons. These held out bravely, despite being outnumbered. Upon receiving Frederick's courier goading him into action, Retzow dispatched his cavalry to the south. These ran into O'Donnell's cavalry. It is unsure if they engaged in combat before O'Donnell retreated to Steindorfeld. By now, Retzow had moved to link up with Prince Charles. They intended to secure the line of retreat for the main Prussian army. Throughout the fighting, most Prussians concentrated themselves around Hochkirch's north, desperately defending against the ever-advancing Austrians. By 6 a.m., Prince Francis arrived. With the remaining infantry, they mounted a counterattack. This counterattack was surprisingly successful and the enemy was pushed from the village. But the continuous artillery barrage did not make much of a victory, let alone a moment that turned the tide. Instead, canister shot killed many infantry and high-ranking officers. Frederick, commanding a fresh infantry force, reached the village shortly after. They mounted another counterattack together with Zieten's cavalry. During the attack, a cannonball killed Prince Francis. An Austrian counterattack from the south with Croat irregulars flanking them from the left and Lacy's cavalry from the right.
Again, like, after watching Austria through so many other points in history, mainly the Napoleonic Wars and after, where they're just constantly getting their butts kicked, it is refreshing. I'd say this series is refreshing because the Austrians have been a threat since day one in terms of military. Like, they just keep, like, catching Frederick at certain points off guard. Well, not keep, but, you know, they've done it, and they've actually given him great fights like this, so... Again, like I said, it's just so weird to see Austria being such a threat in terms of military, but it's also refreshing. I kind of like it, to be honest.
Proved the finishing blow. Frederick called the retreat. It was utter chaos among the Prussian lines. Retzow established the new Prussian line to Warwitz's north. Slowly, battered Prussian infantry straggled towards him. Some regiments lost over 60% of their strength. Around this time, the infantry fighting Arenberg was surrounded. Most surrendered, and a few managed to retreat to the improvised Prussian front line. All cannons fell to the Austrians. By 10 a.m. the battle was over. The majority of the Prussian army retreated to the northwest. Nearly 10,000 soldiers were left in Hochkirch fighting an impossible battle. Despite the incredible chaos and carnage, the retreat was orderly, without panic. The Austrians did not launch a pursuit. The assault was catastrophic for the Prussians. The fact the entire army did not retreat in an uncoordinated rout says a lot about the Prussian discipline. One of Hochkirch's streets was known as Blood Alley, for a river of blood poured down the gutters from the massacre there. The casualty figures were enormous. Around a third of the Prussian army, over 9,000 men, were lost. Besides that, they lost supplies and tents, heavy guns and provisions. The army also lost the king's brother-in-law, Francis of Brunswick, General Geist, and Field Marshal James Keith. Prince Moritz of Anhalt-Dessau was severely wounded and would never recover.
Dang.
The Austrians, despite completely surprising the Prussians, lost some 6,000.
Again, Dawn, once again, has gotten another one-up on Frederick. That's 2-0 right now. Like, Dawn, man, might just be Frederick's, like, arch nemesis, you know?
The battle shook Frederick and left an imprint on the king. Especially the loss of his close friend and confidant, James Keith, was unforgivable. Frederick knew he was solely to...
Yeah, Dawn has created, like, he humiliated Frederick and deprived him of, like a personal wound, not only in terms of a military wound, but a personal wound. Like, man. Amazing.
...to blame for the great disaster. His librarian found him in tears, reciting Racine's poem, Mithridate. 2 days after the battle, Frederick learned of the death of his beloved sister Wilhelmina. In contrast, Vienna was a...
Oh my goodness, just, it keeps piling up on poor Freddy boy. Dang, man. All this personal grief and loss, like... How does he keep going, man? How does he keep going?
...place of festivities upon learning of the victory. The victory at Hochkirch took place on Maria Theresa's name day. Therefore, Hochkirch was welcome news at the party. But characteristically, the cautious Dawn failed to follow up on the victory. Instead, the Russians retreated to their winter quarters beyond the Vistula River, and he lost the momentum. After a few days of depression, Frederick stepped up his game and began organizing a counteroffensive. News reached him of a Turkish offensive along the Danube, which might actually allow him some breathing room. But all this was unnecessary. No more battles would take place this winter. Some sharp skirmishes occurred, but Frederick's movements were enough to unnerve the Austrians. By November 5th, the Austrians abandoned the siege of Neisse as Frederick approached. By late November, Daun retreated to his winter quarters in Bohemia. Territorial control in Hochkirch's aftermath remained surprisingly unchanged. Frederick retained control over Saxony and Silesia. Finally, winter came, and the warring parties lay dormant. However, the 1759 campaign would see renewed warfare and battles. On the early morning of August 12, 1759, Russian General Pyotr Saltykov and Austrian Field Marshal Ernst von Loudon discussed what had to be done. They knew the Prussian army was close to their position. They also knew they significantly outnumbered their enemy. But they did not know to their north, Prussian King Frederick the Great and his entire army had spent the night trekking through the wetlands and woods. As dawn arrived, the army finished deploying along their flank and prepared to launch a devastating attack.
Dang, outflanked once again. You notice how Frederick keeps using the flank? He just keeps going around and just keeps catching their enemies at their flank. Like, he really loves this move. He's like, man, he was reading the old military handbook. He opened the page and he found the oldest trick in the book called the flank, and he was like, I need to use this every chance I get. You know? Honestly, same. If I were a military commander, my only move would be the flank. If I were there, perhaps we can try a flank. If we can't, well then I guess there's gonna be no battle.
Frederick the Great spent the winter months of 1758-59 in Breslau. He augmented his battered army with fresh recruits with considerable success, and he managed to field over 160,000 soldiers by the beginning of spring next year, a number comparable to the previous years. But the quality of these soldiers was another matter. Many of the weathered veterans were exhausted, injured, or dead.
Yeah, like, this is what I've been saying about the manpower. Frederick has been getting into a lot of fights as of late, and, you know, kind of suffering a lot of, I suppose you can say, like, losses, and I've been saying, like, man, what is the Prussian manpower looking like at this moment? And you kind of can see, it's kind of like when Napoleon kept losing soldiers, and then he needed to rely on new conscripts, and then just the quality of his army kind of fell. Like, that's like, it has to be affecting Frederick now, right? But like, France, even at Napoleon's time, had the benefit of being one of the most populous European countries with high manpower reserves. I believe second only to Russia. I don't know about Prussia at this point, though. Like, how much manpower reserves they have. I believe, like, the Napoleonic Wars onward, they probably had one of the lowest, I think. I'm remembering from the Historia Civilis video of the Congress of Vienna, where he kind of broke down the manpower, and I think Prussia had the lowest, but I know that was centuries removed from this, but not centuries, but decades removed from this, but still, like, the manpower thing's gonna start coming into play, right?
Expense was spared to improve the artillery to compensate for the lacking infantry. By the start of the campaign, the Prussian army fielded nearly triple the heavy guns it had at the outbreak of war. Frederick was described as having aged a very good deal recently. His clothes were unkempt, he suffered a severe influenza-type fever and took pride in wearing his patchy clothes. He sought comfort in literature, philosophy, poetry and history, composing a study on Charles XII. Frederick's brother...
Oh, frickin' Charles. You know, I'm not gonna lie, I soured on Charles when we were watching the Great Northern War series. I was with him at first, I was like, okay, but then he baffled me with a lot of his decisions and his stubbornness. Like, I don't know. I'm not gonna lie, I don't hate him, but I'm not a fan of him. Like, by the end, I was kind of frustrated with him. But he was talented. It's just some of his personal flaws got in the way of that talent, I think, unfortunately. Sorry, is that my hot take? I'm not sure, but but yeah. Either way, like, yeah, Frederick's gonna be the amount of stress this man must be going through is insane, and we all know stress can really mess you up.
Brother-in-law Ferdinand of Brunswick dealt with the French on the Western Front, after they launched an ambitious, aggressive, and energetic campaign to recapture Hanover. Ferdinand beat them at the Battle of Minden. This victory made Frederick consider the Western Front nothing more than a far-away theater of war.
Ferdinand is really carrying the West. Like, I might just give him the MVP award because he's holding it down against the French.
He concentrated his army around his kingdom's heartland, and rightfully so. He set up his headquarters at Landeshut. In the 57 and 58 campaigns, Frederick beat the Russians, Austrians, Imperials, and Swedes one by one. A potential convergence of their forces from 4 different directions would be disastrous. Nearby Leipzig, a 35,000-strong Austrian imperial army under Prince Friedrich of Zweibrücken stood ready to invade Saxony. In Bohemia to his south, Field Marshal Daun and the enormous main Austrian army, at least 100,000 strong, wanted to invade Silesia. The Swedes held themselves up in Stralsund, intending to attack against Brandenburg from the north. To the east, the Russian Cossack vanguard contingent marauding the countryside was only a taste of what was to come. Frederick decided to strike first, whereas Ferdinand started the campaign in the west. Prince Henry did so on the Saxon front. In early April, his 30,000-strong army launched an energetic incursion against Bohemia, raiding supply depots, before turning west into Franconia. Here, Henry levied recruits, collected supplies, and heavily impacted the Imperial Army's mobilization. No major battle took place, but the enemy's logistics suffered. The main Prussian army, some 50,000 soldiers, moved to Breslau to respond to any incursions. Around Troppau in Silesia, General Heinrich de la Motte-Fouquet and 13,000 soldiers raided Austrian supply depots, but the Austrians remained dormant. In fact, it wasn't the Austrians, but the Russians who ignited the campaign of 59 in the east. The Russians had a new commander, Prince Saltykov. He was one of the Tsarina's favorites. During spring, the 61-year-old commander collected his army around Posen. On June 25th, his 70,000-strong army departed, marching downstream the Oder. All that remained between him and Berlin was Donau's 23,000-strong force, just like at Zorndorf the year before. The Prussians were heavily outnumbered. News reached Frederick of Saltykov's march, his supposed inexperience, and the poor condition of the Russian army. He also learned Donau wasn't doing anything to stop them. He berated him for moving like a tortoise. He removed him from command, replacing him with General Karl Heinrich von Wedel. He set out with an army numbering no more than 28,000 to intercept the Russians. But simultaneously, Daun began moving, sluggish, as always, creeping towards his southern flank. Things were not looking good, although Daun fortified his camps, and even Austrian records scolded him for how slow he advanced. Saltykov did not have a reputation as a brave or enterprising commander. Because of that, what happened next surprised everyone in the Prussian camp. He outmaneuvered Wedel, whose blind aggression certainly did not help. The armies met nearby Kai, and Saltykov swiftly defeated Wedel, inflicting over 8,000 casualties. A few days later, Saltykov occupied Frankfurt an der Oder. This meant Berlin was only 80 kilometers away and under.
Dang, the Russians are so close. Oh my goodness.
Direct threat. For Frederick, this moment was do or die in the phrase's most literal sense. He tasked Henry with the impossible: hold back Daun's enormous army with no more than 40,000 soldiers. De Motte-Fouquet held the Silesian border with 20,000 troops. Frederick took the remainder of his army to link up with Wedel's survivors and confront Saltykov. The Austrians learned of Saltykov's advance. Daun, cautious as ever, was in an ideal position. He had enough troops to march against Henry or Fouquet and sent forces to augment Saltykov's army. He sent Loudon and Hadik with a 40,000 strong detachment to the Russians. Loudon reached Saltykov on August 2nd. The losses Saltykov suffered against Wedel were well compensated. Hadik's baggage train was ambushed, prompting him to turn around. A week later, Saltykov took the strong defensive heights nearby the small village of Kundersdorf. Frederick took a route similar to the one preceding the Battle of Zorndorf the year before. On August 6, he linked up with Wedel's battered army. They embarked on their march to confront the enemy. Saltykov's army camped at Kundersdorf for several days. He commanded between 65 and 79,000 troops, 4,600 Cossacks, infantry, cavalry, and 250 pieces of heavy artillery. Their deployment stretched in two lines from the Mühlberg to Kundersdorf south. Loudon's force, some 19,000 troops, closed the left flank. Prince Golitsyn commanded 5 large regiments and artillery on the Mühlberg. The Russian artillery was positioned on the Mühlberg, Spitzberg, and in concealed pits. Heavily outnumbered, Frederick felt the pressure to take the initiative. His scouts informed him Saltykov was deployed along a long ridge running southwest from Kundersdorf. The Prussian army numbered around 48,000 troops, 53 battalions of infantry, 59 cavalry squadrons, and 140 pieces of heavy artillery. On the evening of August 10, the Prussian army moved from Frankfurt. A pontoon bridge secured the crossing of the river. The Prussian army approached from the north, infantry in the front, cavalry to the rear. They had to cross wetlands and ponds to get to the Russians, but to avoid this, Frederick planned a march to the east, then turning south before turning west. The weather was sweltering. A strong corps under General Fink remained to the northwest, a diversion to keep the Russians occupied as Frederick launched the actual attack from the east. At dawn, Frederick emerged from the woods and finally saw the battlefield and Russian deployment. He realized he made 2 enormous calculation errors. First, if he were to attack from their east, the Russians would be in a solid position to repel his army. What he initially thought was the Russian rear was the Russian front. Secondly, elevations, marshes, and ponds defended this front line. So Frederick changed his plans. His new objective was to seize the Mühlberg and concentrate the main attack from there. The redeployment was messy and frustratingly slow, heavily impacted by miscommunication and the poor terrain. By 11 a.m., the Prussian artillery positioned itself on small elevations around the Mühlberg. Their goal was to repel the Russians, 5 large regiments from the hill, weaken the right flank, and then launch an attack. They opened fire, and a prolonged artillery duel ensued. The artillery duel lasted for an hour. The Prussians had the upper hand. Then 2 lines of 4 battalions each advanced forward against the Mühlberg. The 5 Russian regiments there suffered significant casualties. Saltykov understood the main attack was imminent. He redeployed his army using a small valley beyond the Mühlberg. This so-called Kuhgrün allowed him to concentrate his army with the right flank snugly protected by Kundersdorf and the left by the wetlands and hills. Frederick's misjudgment of the battle terrain and the Russian formations allowed Saltykov to adequately countermaneuver. The Prussians seized the Mühlberg. Suffering around 200 casualties, they pushed back no less than 12,000 soldiers stationed there, seizing 86 guns. Things were looking good. Frederick's generals urged him to take this as a victory and retreat. His army was exhausted, the heat was scorching, but the king pushed on. Frederick ordered his right wing to continue the march against Kundersdorf and ordered Fink's troops to charge and engage the enemy. By the time the artillery took its positions on the Mühlberg, Saltykov's army finished redeployment along the incredibly narrow valley and pasture, the Kuhgrün. Those who fled the Mühlberg now reinforced the main line. To try and give himself more space, Frederick ordered his center and his left to advance through Kundersdorf, all the while exposed to heavy artillery fire. Frederick's generals warned him to stop the attack, but he did not listen.
Yeah, again, like, it seems like when it comes to the Russians, you know, like, the earlier baggage train battle and him refusing to take it, and now here, out he tried to outmaneuver his enemy, and obviously it's a bit messy, but even then he still managed to take Mulberg. But again, here it's like the army's exhausted and whatnot, but Frederick once again is ignoring his men. Because he really just wants to fight. He really wants to fight them, like... Again, I'm not sure. It depends how it all works out. I'll admit, though, I don't think... It doesn't sound like a good idea to keep fighting. But again, maybe... Just maybe Frederick might pull off a W and, you know, prove me and his generals a bit wrong on this. But I'll admit it does seem a bit iffy. And knowing how the Russians fought before... He's bound to have casualties fighting them, you know? He's not walking out unscathed, I think.
The Prussian left flank advancing towards Kunersdorf ran into several units participating in the North main attack. The barrage of fire and artillery made it nearly impossible to enter the Kugrun. Both sides were putting up the most bitter fight on the Kugrund, and this part of the field was covered with bodies. Our infantry had been marching through sand on a very hot day. They were tormented by thirst and could scarcely drag themselves along. On our side, it was always the same battalions which went into action, whereas the enemy kept bringing up fresh troops. Confusion set in as more Prussian soldiers entered the cluttered valley. Finck's battalions in the north fought with courage, but the Russian artillery and numerical superiority kept them at bay. Russian artillery was ideally positioned to launch barrages against the Prussians cluttered in the valley. The space was too crowded for any serious cavalry engagement. Sure, there were some scattered, uncoordinated cavalry engagements to the south of the village, but due to the marshes and the ponds, the cavalry was unable to maneuver properly. Frederick ordered Seydlitz's dragoons and hussars to launch a charge to the west of the Kugrun. The combined Russo-Austrian dragoon counterattack sent them running. Their retreat allowed the enemy to circle behind the Prussian front lines. Any exhausted infantry sheltering against the Russian artillery now suffered a cavalry charge from the west. The counterattack by Seydlitz pushed them away, but artillery fire prevented him from following up this victory. 3 subsequent cavalry commanders, including Seydlitz, were wounded as the day progressed. General Puttkamer, one of Frederick's favorites, was slain. A final cavalry charge against the Großer Spitzberg led to the Prussian cavalry being subject to an enormous artillery and musket barrage. Loudon, commanding the Cossacks and Austrian cavalry, followed this up with a fierce charge. Prussian cavalry deteriorated and squadrons scattered. The infantry...
My goodness, this looks really bad. The exhaustion and lack of numerical superiority is starting to... It looks like it's seeping in harder now. And I'm kind of worried, because... while they're at some points kind of pushing back the Russians, they're also kind of somewhat being overwhelmed, so... yeah, this doesn't look good. Frederick
was in a miserable state. The close quarter combat and the constant barrages of fire caused mounting casualties. Soltykov kept feeding his battered army reinforcements. Finally, when they saw their cavalry flee, pursued by the Austrian cavalry, it was enough to break even the most disciplined soldier. An advance of the Russian infantry on the right flank and the Cossack regiments mowing down fleeing infantry cemented the defeat. Frederick desperately tried to rally his force, but to no avail. The Prussian retreat was anything but orderly. By the end of the day, there were no more than 3,000 surviving soldiers, who somewhat resembled a battle formation. The rest of his army scattered. The king retreated across the river, and throughout the night he heard shrieks of his soldiers slaughtered by roaming Cossacks. Prussia saw...
Dang. Dude, another L for Frederick. Again, I think he bit off way more than he can chew. The first time he battled the Russians, like, it was kind of more of a standstill-ish. He definitely caught them off guard, but not a decisive enough victory really, because even the Russians claimed it was a victory, so it's a bit iffy. It's a bit meddled. And now we have here where just a disaster, and he probably should have listened to his subordinates on, okay, you took the hill, victory enough, kind of called it quits, but he was too aggressive, I think, and he's making a lot of mistakes. Have you noticed? Like, he allowed Dawn, essentially, he was his slow reaction to Dawn, and now here, he seems to be making some pretty big errors that are causing him a lot of loss that I don't think he can afford, to be honest.
Over 6,000 dead soldiers and 11,000 wounded. Around 1,400 were taken prisoner, resulting in over 19,000 total casualties. That is around 40% of its entire force. He lost most guns, about 172, and 28 flags and standards. The Russians lost 14,000 men. About 2,600 were killed, 700 missing, and 11,000 wounded. The Austrians lost 500 killed, 1,500 wounded, and no more than 500 missing.
Dang, Frederick is done. He's giving up.
The Prussians lost the battle. Not for a lack of courage. Frederick himself was shot several times and had the musket ball holes in his coat to prove it. 2 horses had been shot from under him, and multiple times Zieten's hussars narrowly saved him as Russian Cossacks charged against the king's entourage. Blenheim states Frederick was more liable to a charge of reckless courage than cowardice. He describes Kunersdorf as Frederick's greatest military disaster. Objectively, it certainly was the worst defeat of the Prussian army in 3 years of warfare. Frederick considered the defeat to be in part caused by chance. Historians attribute the defeat to faulty intelligence and inadequate reconnaissance. Kunersdorf was a nail in the Prussian coffin. With a severely crushed and heavily battered Prussian army, there was nothing stopping General Soltykov from linking up with Dawn and marching onto Berlin. Nothing could stop the complete, utter destruction of the Kingdom of Prussia. Or was there yet hope? On the early morning of November 20th, 1758, Prussian General Fink and his army camped around the village of Maxen.
British accent? Whoa, am I hearing this wrong? Okay, sudden change. Did he hire a narrator? Is it me or... Sorry, I also have my air conditioning, but is there a new narrator now? He's not doing it himself, or... Funny or not, he's just putting on a British accent.
The king tasked him with an important and crucial...
Okay, yeah, that is important. Like, oh my goodness. Yo, loving the step up. Loving the step up of quality there, my man. I see you. You know you've made it big when you hire a British person to narrate your war videos. I mean, Kings and Generals did it. Epic History, History March. Like, he's coming into his own. If I were to ever start one of these, I'd hire a British man right off the bat. Be like, can you narrate? Can you narrate this war video I'm making? Okay, sorry, that caught me off guard.
He was to cut off the Austrian army from their supply lines. As dawn set in, several scouts rushed towards his quarters. Austrian troops were approaching from not one, not two, but 3 sides. They were surrounded. There was no way out. General Fink had no other option but to fight for survival. The Battle of Kunersdorf was the worst defeat of the Prussian army in 3 wars. Prussia's 48,000-strong army deteriorated into, at best,
3,000 soldiers resembling somewhat of a fighting force. There was no way the kingdom would survive this, as the Austrians, Russians...
Yeah, everything's different. Look at these new portraits, like, this is just a step of equality.
Imperials and Swedes had the perfect opportunity to converge against it. Exactly what Frederick the Great had feared all this time. In the battle's direct aftermath, Frederick was violently ill, exhausted, depressed, and contemplated suicide or abdication.
Yeah. My goodness. I had heard that he used AI a lot, as the history gets deeper. Like, I'm not sure if that was like a critique or a compliment for House of History. Though suddenly, like, I feel like I'm watching a completely new person. Like, you can just see the sudden change. Yeah. How old is Frederick at this point? When we began, he was like late 20s. Like, what is he, like 30s, 40s? Dude looks like he's 70 though. All his portraits, he looks like he's like 70 years old. You think he always looked old? Like, even when he was like 19, the dude looked like he was 70. Always looks old. That's probably just from the sheer stress he's always been under. Like, it aged him. There's kind of like photos of like Abraham Lincoln, I think, is a pretty famous one. Like, if you look at him at the beginning of his presidency and afterwards, dude looked like he aged like 90, like a lot of years. Like, don't underestimate stress, guys. It can get you.
The kingdom was in dire straits. But despite their victory at Kunersdorf, the Russians also received an enormous blow. Their losses were not to be underestimated. Saltykov lost 4,700 men at the Battle of Kai, and another 19,000 at Kunersdorf. His army bore the absolute brunt of the damage. When General von Lauden urged Saltykov to launch a pursuit, the Russian general did not want to risk worsening the Pyrrhic victory. He did not pursue it, and neither did Lauden. The Prussian army, or what was left of it, was left alone. It led to a remarkable recovery. When the Prussians learned their enemies would not pursue them, everything was set in motion to recover from their losses. 2 weeks after the battle, Frederick wrote a letter to Prince Henry.
Oftentimes I notice that the Prussians keep getting saved from the Russian onslaught because the Russians just either pull out or just don't continue fighting. So really, it seems like the Russians, not pursuing has saved the Prussians more often than not.
I can announce to you the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Just when the enemy had crossed the Oder and could have finished the war by risking a second battle, he marched in opposite direction. I marched first to cut him off from that part of Lusatia, which was being obliged to keep him supplied. Officers rounded up those who fled. Soldiers returned when they realized a counterattack was not imminent. General Fink levied the unscathed small Prussian army in Pomerania to march them towards Frederick's camp. By the end of August, his army numbered 33,000 soldiers. Frederick was aware he required more luck than he could realistically expect if he were to beat the Austrians. He calculated Daun commanded around 90,000. The quality of Prussian soldiers was nothing to write home about.
Yeah, he has to have lost so many powers, man. I mean, you know, soldiers, like, experienced, hardened veterans, as these losses are mounting up. He's probably gonna have to rely on fresh conscripts. Like, he can't afford a sustained, prolonged war like this. It's just too much, like, loss and resource zapping.
Many of them were freebooters and rogues. Frederick was unnerved and impatient, understandably so. Large armies surrounded his kingdom, and he was entirely in the dark about what plans its commanders had. In the east, Daun sent General Lacy to Saltykov to propose an attack against Berlin or seizing Silesia. Saltykov was wary, intending to retreat to his winter quarters. It wasn't until the interference of Vienna and St. Petersburg that Saltykov conceded. If Daun reinforced him, he agreed to march on Glogau. Frederick panicked. He had been shadowing Saltykov. and now he was at risk of facing an Austrian and Russian assault. He did not want to let the Russians seize Glogau, and despite being outnumbered, he resigned himself to defending it to the death. Around Saxony, combat began heating up. The Imperial army under Prince von Zweibrücken captured Halle, Leipzig, and Wittenberg. They marched on Dresden. A ragtag bunch of poor battalions under Johann von Wunsch was sent to defend the city. Ferdinand, in the west, could spare no soldiers, but the old general managed to surprise his enemies and his king. His recapture of Wittenberg and Torgau was the first positive news that reached the king in a long while. This was fantastic news, be it not that Dresden's commander surrendered to the Imperials one day before news of Wunsch's approach reached him. Positive news followed. Daun failed to reinforce Saltykov with food and artillery. The Russian commander refused to lay siege to Glogau, and a stalemate developed. The Prussians and Russians faced each other, neither side engaging in combat. Frederick finished his monograph on King Charles XII during this period. Surprisingly, he had ample free time. Whereas the East was in a lull, action heated up around Saxony. Frederick ordered Henry and his 20,000 troops to join his generals there. The prince was reluctant, but once he went, he was unstoppable. His army marched 50 miles in 2 nights. At Hoyerswerda, he fought a corps of irregulars, capturing 1,800 prisoners, losing only 44 men. Henry's advance caused Daun to hurry towards Dresden, reportedly in such a rush that he lost 3,000 soldiers underway due to exhaustion and desertion.
Dang. That's uncharacteristic of Daun to actually be moving quick. So he must, you know, he's caught off guard and like scared if you got Daun running.
In Saxony, a stalemate developed as well. Although Henry worried immensely about his chances against Daun, Frederick ordered him to shadow the Austrians. On October 15th, Saltykov finally broke the stalemate and began his long withdrawal to his winter quarters at Thorn, much to the anger of the Austrians. Loudon was forced to start the long march through Poland to Moravia for his winter quarters. This freed up all Prussian soldiers in the east. The anxious Henry would soon be reinforced as the king embarked on the trek westward.
Again, often more than not in this series, the Russian in action has saved Prussia more than anything, you know?
His confidence was returning. Right before Frederick arrived, Henry defeated Arenberg, who tried to outflank him nearby Torgau. Surprisingly, and against all odds, things were looking up for the Prussians. In early November, the brothers met at Torgau. United, their army numbered around 60,000. Again, quantity did not mean quality, but things were certainly recovering. Dresden was still in Austrian hands, but most of the electorate had been reconquered. Frankly, the situation for Prussia was better than expected. Daun refused to engage in battle. Instead, he waited for the Prussians to make a mistake while preparing his retreat. But Frederick wanted Daun out of Saxony on his terms, so he ordered General von Fink, together with 15,000 soldiers, to march south. At
True, Daun has gotten the drop on Henry twice now. Frederick. You know, like, now Frederick needs to try to take that initiative, because Daun has been doing things when he wants to. He's taken the initiative, Frederick needs to take it back.
South of Dresden, he had to cut off the Austrian supply lines, forcing their abandonment of Dresden. On November 19th, Fink's army reached the village of Maxen. It was one of the first snowy days of the year. The village stood on a plateau surrounded by the Erzgebirge. Most pastures were frozen. He commanded around 4,000 cavalry and 11,000 infantry. Daun was onto the Prussians, and he knew that once part of the Prussian army was isolated, it was an easy target. He divided a 32,000-strong army into parts, all converging on Maxen from different sides. His army approached from the southwest and set up camp at Diepoldiswalde. An imperial army guarded the village of Dohna in the northeast, while General Anton Joseph von Brentano-Cimaroli approached from the northwest. Both commanders commanded 16,000 troops. Fink was outnumbered at least 2-1. Fink deployed his army in a defensive crescent position on the hills around Maxen towards Schmorsdorf. He was well aware his enemies surrounded him, and he did his best to deploy his army strategically. Besides the central deployment, he deployed Wünsch's small corps between Falkenhayn and Sursen. On the morning of November 20th, covered by fog, Daun's army departed from Diepoldiswalde, a 2-hour march away from Maxen. Among the commanders were Siskevich and...
This is such a bad position that Fink has found himself in. Again, Daun has positioned himself on multiple areas converging. Sometimes operations like these can be really tough to execute, mainly due to communication and etc. But things seem to be going well for Daun, leading them to converge and give Fink a battle on multiple fronts, which is never ideal. My goodness, this is the conditions are not optimal.
Lacey. Cimaroli also embarked on a march. The Austrian armies converged on the small village and Fink's defensive positions. The frozen ground made moving difficult for artillery and cavalry. The first skirmishes erupted around Reinhardsgrimma, where Daun's vanguard expelled Prussian pickets. These retreated to Maxen, with Daun's army in pursuit. By late morning, Daun's infantry scaled the hills to Maxen's south and installed the first artillery pieces. These opened fire against Fink's left flank. Nearly an hour of an artillery duel followed. The high ground Daun occupied dominated most, if not all, withdrawal routes from the Prussian position. They were surrounded. There was no way out. After the initial...
Caught like a rat in a cage. My goodness, this... Oh man, but as we've seen, there's a precedent that overwhelming manpower can defeat the Prussians. It's like almost their kryptonite. And Daun has that in spades. And I don't know much about Fink, but so far Daun has proven himself as probably the best of the Austrians. So, who has gotten the drop on Frederick. So, Fink is facing odds, insurmountable odds, right now.
Artillery duel, Daun ordered his infantry to advance. 2 infantry columns charged ahead, with cavalry flanking each side. Combat erupted on the hills between Wittgensdorf and Maxen. Heavily outnumbered, the Prussians quickly gave way. Before too long, several Austrian battalions pushed into Maxen. This caused the Prussian left flank to be cut off from the remainder of their army, including the cavalry.
No!
These retreated.
Oh, that's so bad.
Because the horses were getting restless from the continued artillery bombardment. The attack had already been underway for a while when Cimaroli and his army arrived. Part of his army faced the Prussian right flank, and part of it lined up to flank them and attack their rear. Despite being outnumbered, Fink tried to prevent this from happening by taking the initiative. He ordered his cuirassiers to launch a charge against the Austrian position, but the ground was frozen. The cavalry charge did not take up speed, and the Austrian volleys easily picked off the Prussians. When Cimaroli's artillery began firing grapeshot, the cavalry broke. It was a disaster, and his cavalry retreated. Fink spent considerable time rallying them. As this was ongoing, Daun linked up with Cimaroli. They launched a coordinated general attack against the Prussian center. Again heavily outnumbered, The infantry was easily overwhelmed. The vanguard retreated, leaving standards, flags, and artillery up for grabs. Some Prussian regiments tried to launch a counterattack. The Austrian cavalry was close enough to nip this in the bud, despite the rugged terrain. Dragoons launched a counteroffensive, routing the infantry. It was a disaster. Fink understood the severity of
Completely. He got his butt kicked.
the situation. He rounded up whatever troops he could find and marched north towards Wunsch's contingent. But the Austrians were everywhere, and he didn't get further than Schmorsdorf. Many soldiers were left behind to be captured by the Austrians, as Fink haphazardly tried to get his army in battle position at Schmorsdorf. Meanwhile, in the background, a Reichsarmee contingent was advancing from Dohna, Burghardswalde, and Wiesenstein. Combat continued, but the remaining Prussians managed to keep the advancing Austrians and Reichsarmee back for now. Because it was a short November day.
Oh my goodness. Completely trapped. This is such a awful position to be in. I really feel bad for Fink, man.
Night fell early. Under cover of darkness, Fink's army retreated towards Falkenhayn. Here, they linked up with Wunsch's corps, which had been stationed there since the beginning. As they left Schmorsdorf, the Austrians immediately seized the village. The Reichsarmee contingents kept a close eye on their every movement. Fink tried to get his cavalry to find an escape route. He was informed there was none, and he could do nothing but request a surrender to Daun.
Yeah, I was gonna be like, is this gonna try to fight his way out? But I think surrendering is a much better option at this point.
The Austrian commander told him he would only accept a surrender if this included the cavalry and Wunsch's corps. Seeing no reasonable way out, Fink conceded. Fink was surrounded, cut off, and forced to capitulate. As a result, 2,000 Prussians became a casualty and 13,000 were captured. 16 battalions, 36 squadrons. Among them were 9 generals, 500 officers, and 71 artillery pieces, 44 ammunition wagons, and 96 flags. Besides Kunersdorf, this was one of the most significant numerical losses Prussia suffered during the war. Daun lost 930.
This is where we need to end the video. Oh, holy crap. I guess I'll see you guys tomorrow while we continue this.